The skies of Corn Field were bleeding fire, and Sergeant Cole Vanner limped through it like a man half alive, half ash. His armor had cracked down the ribs from a glancing drone strike, his left leg barely responding, and each step sent a jolt through his spine that blurred vision with pain. But he kept going, jaw tight, one hand being the burn-scorched rifle slung across his back, and the other dragging behind him a field pack twice as heavy as it should have been. He wasn't retreating, just trying to find higher ground, some place to die that wasn't soaked in plasma and smoke. Then he heard her, a sound, thin, broken, barely louder than the wind slipping through shattered walls. Not a soldier's cry, not a Terran's voice, just a breathless whimper wrapped in rubble and static. Cole froze mid-step, instincts raging to ignore it, to survive, to move, but his gut pulled hard in the opposite direction. He turned, crawling through a half-collapsed corridor of what had once been a Corellian outpost, a place now carved up by war like meat on a butcher's slab. And there, beneath a jagged beam and a sheet of torn thermal mesh, lay the smallest alien he'd ever seen. No more than 6 or 7 in her species' years, with thin translucent green skin marked by bruises, bright violet eyes wide with terror, and long lashes wet with dust and fear. She clutched a silver pendant shaped like a spiral sun, cracked through its center, and said nothing as she stared up at him. Cole's breath caught. Not in pain, not in confusion, but because for a second she reminded him of his little sister back home, before Earth conscripted him, before all the burning, before all the noise. "Hey," he whispered, crouching low, voice soft like it hadn't been in years. "You hurt?" She shook her head. No sound, no movement beyond that, and crawled slightly toward him. He should have walked away. He knew it. Every second he stayed was a second closer to death. But when she reached out that small hand, fingers trembling with cold and ash, he grabbed it before logic could stop him. And he lifted her into his arms like he'd done it 1,000 times before. The war zone didn't forgive sentiment, but Cole moved like a man who didn't care if the war approved. With the child bundled under his arm, and the terrain shifting beneath the roar of shifting mechs and falling airships, he stumbled through no man's land with a fire burning behind his eyes brighter than the city's set aflame. The little girl didn't cry, not once. She only clung to him like he was the last unbroken thing in a world designed to crush. Every few steps, he'd look down to make sure she was breathing. Still there, still holding that cracked pendant like it had power. They crossed a trench littered with smoking helmets and melted bones, slipping past a broken scout drone that sparked as it tried to turn. Cole paused to check his pulse. Low. Too low. His leg was giving out, and his vision was edging darker around the rims. But when the girl buried her face in his chest as the wind carried the wail of distant detonations, something primal in him rose like an old instinct. Protect. He found a half-collapsed supply depot and ducked inside, laying her down gently while he checked the rations in his pack. Barely enough for himself, let alone 2. Still, he tore a protein strip in half and gave her the larger piece. She hesitated, then ate it in slow, careful bites, never taking her eyes off him. When she finished, she touched his wound gently, right along the stitched shrapnel tear in his armor. Her fingers glowed faintly where they touched, warm and trembling. "You're not one of ours, are you?" Cole asked, leaning back against a metal wall, exhaling hard. She tilted her head slightly, blinking slow, then whispered her first word. "Mama." It hit him like a bullet to the chest. Whoever her mother was, she wasn't here. Maybe gone. Maybe dead. Maybe praying to gods he didn't know that someone like him would find her daughter before it was too late. Cole looked toward the doorway, flames dancing in the night beyond, and gritted his teeth. He pulled the girl close, wrapping her in his field jacket, and said in a hoarse, determined voice, "Then I guess we'd better find Mama." She curled against him, finally asleep, and for the first time in days, Cole stayed awake, not out of fear of death, but because he had something worth living for. Something small. Something alive. Something that needed him to keep walking through hell with fire at his back and hope pressed to his heart. By the third sunrise, or what passed for sunrise in a sky filled with chemical haze and drifting debris, Cole could no longer tell whether the burning in his legs came from exhaustion or infection. The wound on his side had gone raw, the field dressing soaked through and crumbling, but he didn't stop. He carried the girl now with a makeshift sling made from his own shirt, her weight light as air, but her presence heavier than any weapon he'd held in war. She had begun humming softly in her sleep, a haunting tune he couldn't place, something both lullaby and prayer, and it clung to him like a ghost even after her breath quieted. They climbed over the broken shell of a collapsed bridge once meant to connect the planetary expressway, where the enemy patrols had laid pulse mines in neat rows. Cole had memorized the flicker pattern of their sensors from a training drill 5 years ago, and somehow, even with his vision going in and out like a faulty comlink, he made it through, barely, limping with gritted teeth and a shallow breath. At one point, he slipped and hit the ground hard enough to crack bone, and the girl awoke screaming, not from fear of the sound or the minefield, but from fear that he wouldn't get back up. His hand trembled as he lifted himself again. She pressed the glowing pendant to his wound with a soft cry, and it flared once, blinding white, before dimming again. It didn't heal him, not truly, but the pain dulled for a time, as if her will alone refused to let him fail. That night, under the skeleton of an abandoned satellite dish, Cole built a fire from wet metal wiring and old combat ration wrappers. The girl finally whispered her name, Elantra. He repeated it like a secret, low and reverent. She smiled for the first time, and in that moment, the war couldn't touch them. They were 4 days out from Terran forward lines when the storm began. Acid wind, purple lightning, and winds fierce enough to shred armor. Cole had found an old evacuation pod half buried in soot. The hatch melted shut from a direct hit, but its inner compartment was intact enough to shield them. Inside, the pod smelled like rust and old fuel, but it was safe, and that was more than he could have asked for. Elantra curled into his side, eyes wide with wonder at the storm, like she didn't fear it, only recognized it, like a thing she'd seen before in dreams. She asked him questions now. About Earth, about Terran trees, about what blue really looked like, because she'd never seen a sky that color, and he, in his broken voice, told her everything. About old rivers, about horses he'd seen once on a base tour, about the feel of rain that didn't melt your skin. At one point, she placed her small hands on his jaw and said something in her native tongue, something that made the air around them shimmer for a second. When he asked what it meant, she only replied, "You are the keeper now." He didn't understand, but she said it with the gravity of royalty, like it was more than a compliment, like it was a title. Later, just as the storm began to fade, a long-range enemy scout drone passed overhead, sleek, black, and slow, scanning for life signs. Cole pressed Elantra beneath a layer of discarded thermal panels, pulling himself halfway over her, gun drawn but useless. The drone hesitated in midair, clicked once, then moved on, as if something in the girl's presence warped its senses. Cole didn't question it. He just breathed out and kissed the top of her head. And when the storm passed and they stepped into the quiet valley that marked the edge of Terran territory, he whispered under his breath, "Almost home, Elantra. Just 1 more mile." She didn't speak this time. She just squeezed his hand tighter. The valley before them stretched like a wound that refused to close. Smoke curled from half-buried wreckage, and the air carried the sharp tang of ozone, scorched metal, and blood. Cole staggered across it with Elantra pressed to his chest, every step an argument between life and collapse. His armor had nearly disintegrated, boots torn to their threads, and his side now pulsed with a deep fever that made his vision waver and tilt. Terran signal beacons flickered faintly on the other side of the field, real ones, not enemy traps. Cole recognized their tone, the exact pulse pattern of his division's emergency frequency, like a heartbeat calling him back to a world he wasn't sure still wanted him. He didn't care. All he wanted was to put Elantra in safe hands before his legs finally gave out. Halfway across the open ground, the whistle of plasma fire ripped through the silence. A warning shot, followed by a distant voice crackling through a megaphone. "Identify yourself or be fired upon." Cole didn't raise his hands. He couldn't. He barely managed to turn toward the sound and rasp out, "Sergeant Cole Vanner, 32nd Infantry, requesting evac. Civilian child, alien, royal blood." There was a pause. Then orders barked, then boots, then light. He blinked against the brightness as Terran medics swarmed in, weapons raised but not fired. One of them, a tall woman with sun-scorched skin and sharp eyes, reached for Elantra with gloved hands, but the child recoiled and clung to Cole's neck. "Only him," she said in perfect Terran, her voice clear despite exhaustion. They looked at him with confusion, with something close to awe. Cole, too weak to respond, simply nodded and collapsed with her still wrapped around his chest. The medics caught them both, and the last thing he heard before the world faded into black was a voice whispering over a comlink. "Call Central Command. We found the missing royal heir." Cole awoke 3 days later in a sterile white medbay with machines humming like lullabies and light spilling through reinforced glass windows high above his cot. His body was cleaner, his wounds bound in stim silk and his heartbeat steady on a nearby monitor. But something was wrong. Too quiet, too still, and for a moment panic seized him. "Elantra," he croaked. The door hissed open. Not a doctor, not a nurse, but her. She strode in like the storm that had once torn the skies above them, clothed in layered crystal armor that shimmered like it was forged from sunlight and memory. Her skin was silver blue, her hair coiled in spirals of jeweled fire, and her presence carried the gravity of royalty so intense the room seemed to shrink around her. The medics outside bowed so low they nearly touched the floor. Elantra ran ahead of her. She leapt onto the bed and curled beside him like nothing had changed, as if this white room was just another campfire. "Told you he'd wake up," she said with pride that sounded ancient and innocent all at once. The queen, Elantra's mother, stepped forward, her eyes sharp with judgment, then melting into something deeper. "You carried her through hell," she said softly, voice thick with an accent laced in stars. "You shielded her body with your own. You fed her while you bled." Cole tried to sit up, but pain folded him back again. "I didn't know who she was," he rasped. "That's what makes you worthy," the queen replied. She reached into a silk case and lifted out a ceremonial blade, Corellian steel, engraved with the royal crest and names of the past guardians. She placed it across his chest with a bow so slow, so reverent, the medics outside gasped. "You are no longer soldier," she said. "You are protector of the heir." Cole blinked in disbelief. "But I'm just Terran," she finished for him with a nod, "and exactly what our empire needs." Elantra smiled soft. Cole could say nothing. Because for once in his life, words were too small for what he had become. Even before he could leave his medbed, Cole Vanner's name began to echo across the stars. First whispered in disbelief by Terran soldiers, then spoken with reverence across the alien worlds once hostile to his kind. The soldier who had carried the heir of the Corellian dynasty through an active war zone became a symbol neither species expected. The bridge between bloodlines, a legend in the making. Yet behind the ceremony and news broadcasts, beneath the polished speeches and diplomatic overtures, something darker stirred in the undercurrent of the galaxy. Not everyone was pleased that a Terran now bore the royal sigil etched into his armor, gifted by a queen known for her ruthless diplomacy. Cole didn't care for politics. He hadn't asked for honor, and he certainly hadn't asked to become the personal guardian to a girl whose identity shook the fabric of alien civilization. But every time he tried to pass the responsibility on, Elantra would look at him with those endless violet eyes and say nothing, just slide her hand into his, a silent decree that no title or force in the stars could undo. He didn't understand how deeply entwined their fates were until he walked into the palace's war chamber one morning and found the queen speaking to generals about assassins. Assassins sent for the child. Assassins that wouldn't care if the guardian died first. He was offered a personal guard. He refused. "They'll get in the way," he muttered, checking the plasma charge in his battered sidearm. The queen studied him, eyes narrowed like twin blades. "You would stand alone against a galactic order that wants you dead?" Cole holstered the weapon and shrugged. "Wouldn't be the first time." But Elantra knew. She knew the cost. And when she watched him train alone in the court's shattered garden, she crept behind him and whispered in the voice of someone much older than her years, "They fear you because you protect something they can't control." He turned. She stood in the moonlight of a twin-starred sky, the same cracked pendant still hanging from her neck. "I'm not afraid," she added, as if the words were meant to carry him through what would come next. Cole smiled, the rare kind that reached his eyes. "Then, neither am I." It began with silence, too perfect to be natural, too still for a place as alive as the royal keep. The wind stopped, the stars above flickered as if holding their breath. Cole, half asleep in his quarters just off the central throne room, opened his eyes moments before the first blade slipped between the wall seams and thudded into the pillow where his head had just been. He rolled, drew his sidearm, and was halfway to the door before the second strike came, a figure clad in obsidian mesh, moving like smoke with a blade that shimmered green. Cole ducked beneath it, slammed his shoulder into the assassin's chest, and fired once. The blast missed, but it gave him enough space to call out, "Secure the air, now." But Elantra was already running toward him. She collided with his legs, clutching the cracked pendant that now pulsed like a living heart. "They're here," she breathed, eyes too calm for a child. They were waiting for the moonshift. More followed. 3, then 5, slipping through the palace like venom in a bloodstream, cutting through armored guards like they were paper. The queen's voice roared through the comm system, issuing lockdown commands, but it was Cole who held the line. He kicked over a ceremonial statue, took cover, fired shot after shot while shielding Elantra with his body. Blood sprayed. Shouts rang. The hall echoed with thunder and fury. One assassin lunged. Cole spun with his combat knife and buried it deep, snarling through gritted teeth. Not this time. When it was done, 6 bodies lay broken across the chamber floor, and Cole, half drenched in his own blood, held Elantra against his chest, panting. "You okay?" She nodded, but tears welled in her eyes as she looked around at the chaos. Cole brushed her hair from her face, hand shaking, and whispered, "As long as I'm alive, no one gets past me. I swear it." She didn't answer. She just placed the pendant against his chest and whispered the same word she had on the battlefield, a word that now echoed with terrifying clarity. "Keeper." And in that moment, even the queen, watching through the security feed, standing breathless and still, knew that something had changed forever. The palace walls were scorched and bleeding by the time reinforcements arrived. Elantra had been escorted to a subterranean vault by Cole himself, who refused even the queen's own elite guard from touching her. His armor hung in shreds, his sidearm long empty, and one eye swollen shut. But he moved like a revenant born in war, dragging a fallen throne room gate closed behind him with a roar that sounded more beast than man. The queen arrived moments later, breathless and livid, only to find her daughter clutched safely in the arms of a man whose blood trailed in his wake like ribbons of devotion. "You were supposed to wait for my guards," she hissed, voice breaking under strain. Cole didn't respond. He simply turned Elantra over to her, gently, and staggered backward until his legs gave out. The queen caught him, not with her arms, but with a silence so profound it shook the last assassin's breath out of the dying air. Later, as healers flooded the court, a crowd gathered at the blast-shattered gates of the palace. Terrans, Corellians, even species from the neutral planets. Word had spread. The human had lived. The human had bled. And the human had not let go of the child even as his body failed him. When he awoke in the queen's personal sanctum, his torso wrapped in luminous healing cloth and his lungs stiff from fluid, she sat beside him, a crown hovering inches from her lap. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, tapping the metal circlet of entwined crystal. Cole shook his head. "Some kind of hat?" She chuckled once, sharp, short, and real. "It is the ceremonial band of the guardian kin. It has never been worn, until today." He blinked, unsure if he was dreaming, but Elantra stood behind her, smiling, arms folded with royal ease and childlike delight. "You already earned it," she said. And for the first time in the galaxy's long war-stained memory, the guardian crown was placed upon a Terran's head, not out of politics or debt, but by the will of a queen and the love of a daughter who'd found her home in the arms of a soldier. Months passed, but the legend of the human who guarded the alien air only grew, spreading like wind through vacuum, like light through nebulae. Cole no longer wore standard armor. He bore Corellian ceremonial robes laced with armored thread, worn over a belt that still held his Terran military dog tags, half melted from plasma fire. He sat not beside the queen but between her and her daughter, a symbol that unity was not a myth, because they had seen it, bled for it, carried it through fire and betrayal. They called him Karak Valthra, the flame wall in the old tongue. Some emissaries hated him, some kissed his boots. But all feared what he represented. A Terran who had not only survived the Empire's crucible, but had changed it. Cole took none of the glory for himself. He still trained at dawn with the palace guards, still kept the blade Elantra had carved from salvaged hull metal, still watched over her as if assassins might leap from the marble walls at any moment. But the Queen had stopped asking him to sit during meetings, because he never left her side, and no one dared speak unless he listened. One night, as the stars flared blue across the horizon, Elantra climbed into the viewing chamber where he sat alone, looking out over the domed city lit with peace fires. She curled beside him in silence, as she always did, now a little taller, a little wiser. "They still don't understand," she whispered. "Who?" he asked. "The ones who bow," she murmured. "They don't understand that it wasn't your strength. It was your refusal to let go." Cole looked at her and smiled. "That's all war ever is, kid. The ones who hold on longest write the ending." And in that glass chamber between twin moons and memory, the orphaned future queen rested her head on the shoulder of the human who had once been nothing more than a dying soldier with a little girl in his arms. And everything that would follow had already been sealed in the fire they had walked through together.